The 17th of March, 1945. Minus 50 degrees. 1B-17 drifts 200 yards behind the formation. 20-plus German fighters peel off and roll in for the kill. In the tail sits 19-year-old Sergeant Benjamin Warner, small-town Ohio farm boy, 6 months out of high school, and right now his twin. 50 calibers are frozen solid. The turret is locked dead. He literally cannot move the guns. The crew knows it. The Germans know it. Everyone thinks the bomber is already dead. In the next 11 minutes, that terrified teenager will shoot down 9 Luftwaffe fighters using nothing but his boots, blood, and a refusal to die. This is the day the frozen sky caught fire. The morning began like countless others. A briefing. A map of Germany covered in red circles, and officers speaking words that no longer sounded real. Oil refineries, marshalling yards, airfields, industrial targets. Mission 892, they called it, but numbers mattered less than routine. Crews drank weak coffee, checked parachutes, and scribbled last-minute notes home just in case the day became one of those days the 100th bomb group was famous for. The bloody 100th earned its name through sacrifice, not myth. Entire squadrons lost in a single day. Dozens of empty bunks, smoking holes in farmland that once held crews just like today's. Anyone flying with the 100th understood that luck was fleeting and death was patient. Our baby was old by bomber standards. 67 missions had taken a toll on her aluminum bones, but she kept flying because she had to. Her pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Jones, trusted her. The crew trusted each other, but the tail gunner, Sergeant Benjamin F. Warner, trusted nothing except his own senses. At 19, he was the youngest aboard, a kid from Clyde, Ohio, thrust into a war he never asked for, occupying the most isolated position on the aircraft. The tail turret looked glamorous on posters, 2 long, 50 caliber guns pointing defiantly into the sky. But inside it was a cramped, frozen coffin where visibility was everything and comfort was nothing. Warner fit there because he was small, quick, and had a gift for hitting moving targets. In gunnery school, instructors wrote, "Exceptional deflection shooter" on his record. They didn't write that he was terrified every time he crawled into that turret, because nobody admitted fear out loud. He never wanted the tail. It was too exposed, too vulnerable. No armor, no heater, no insulation. Just a thin metal frame and a plexiglass dome separating him from the world's coldest battlefield. And on this morning, that battlefield stretched endlessly behind him. A sky brilliant with cold sunlight, contrails forming white scars. Hundreds of bombers humming together like a single giant organism. Somewhere far below, German radar tracked them. Somewhere ahead, flak guns waited. And somewhere in between, the Luftwaffe prepared for what would become its largest interception of the war. While the bomber stream pushed deeper into Germany, Warner's turret fought against the cold. Hydraulic fluid thickened, metal stiffened. The motors responded slower. He flexed his gloved hands, breathing heavily through his oxygen mask, trying to warm himself through layers of fleece and leather that still couldn't stop the chill from settling deep into his bones. He tapped the foot pedals and squeezed the hand grips, rotating the guns a few degrees, making sure everything worked. The turret groaned like a dying animal. He didn't like that sound. He'd heard it before, on a mission where another crew's tail guns froze, leaving them helpless. He prayed silently that the same wouldn't happen today, but fate wasn't listening. A tiny flak burst under the left wing jolted the aircraft, not enough to damage anything serious, but just enough to reduce engine RPM, just enough to reduce airspeed by a hair. The kind of shift that meant nothing to the crew in the front, but meant everything to a bomber formation relying on precise spacing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, our baby began to drift backward. The gap widened, 50 yards, 100, 200, the difference between safety and being marked as prey. Warner saw the drift. He cursed. He radioed forward. "We're falling back," the pilot acknowledged. "Working on it." But the formation moved, and they didn't. The bomber, now a lonely figure in a sky meant for strength in numbers, became the exact kind of target German fighter pilots were trained to recognize instantly. And those pilots were already climbing. Pairs, trios, entire swarms rising from cloud banks and hidden airfields, guided by radar, driven by desperation. They had lost 1,000 fighters in the last month. They were burning the last of their aviation fuel. Today was their final true swing at the American juggernaut. Warner scanned the sky and saw them first, black dots forming in the far distance, growing larger every second. His blood ran cold. Bandits, lots of them, the intercom crackled. The waist gunners swore. The pilot stiffened. The co-pilot muttered a prayer. And Warner felt his heart hammering against his ribs like it wanted to escape. He tried to rotate the turret. It didn't budge. Panic stabbed through him. He forced it harder. Nothing. Frozen. Solid. Locked at an angle that left the bomber exposed. He slammed his boots against the turret ring. Pain shot through his feet. Another kick. A groan. Maybe an inch of movement. Maybe not. He didn't know. He only knew death was coming straight toward him, and his guns were pointed in the wrong direction. He hit the intercom. Tail. Turret frozen. Can't traverse. Silence. Then the pilot's grim voice. "They're coming straight at you, Benny. Hold on." The German fighters closed in, 20 or more. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Engines screaming. Guns glinting in the sun. Warner kicked again, harder, until his toes felt wet and warm inside his boots. Blood. He didn't care. He kicked again. And again. And finally, the turret jerked a few inches. Just enough to bring the approaching fighters into his peripheral vision. Just enough to convince him he wasn't dead yet. The first pair dove at them. Warner grabbed the triggers, praying the guns would fire. The first pair of fighters came in low and level. Exactly where the turret should have been pointing if it had been working. Warner squeezed both triggers out of instinct more than hope, and to his shock, both 50 caliber guns thundered to life. The recoil was a violent, living force in his frozen arms, rattling his entire body. He fought to keep control. Muzzle flashes strobed the interior of the turret. Tracers streaked across the frigid air like orange comets. The lead Messerschmitt flew straight into the stream of molten metal. Rounds ripped through its radiator, and in an instant a white plume of glycol erupted from the nose, followed by flames bursting outward like a volcanic blast. The fighter pitched downward and vanished behind the bomber, leaving only a spiraling trail of smoke. The second enemy aircraft tried to adjust, banking slightly to avoid the fire. But Warner dragged his stubborn turret another inch and walked bullets across its wing. The moment they hit, the left aileron sheared off, sending the aircraft flipping into an uncontrolled roll. It disappeared in a whirling plunge toward the cloud deck far below. Warner didn't celebrate. He barely breathed. 2 kills meant nothing when 20 more were climbing. Already he could see new specks rising, growing, forming attack patterns. 3 full 190 seconds from below, engines whining with murderous intention. Their pilots were experienced. Fighters that came from beneath were notoriously difficult for tail gunners to counter. Warner tried to depress the guns downward, but the turret resisted like a block of ice. He kicked again, feeling the skin on his toes tear deeper. A jolt of agony shot through him, but he kept going. Another kick. Then he slammed his entire body weight against the hand grips, forcing the frozen mechanism downward by sheer will. When the guns dropped far enough to expose a sliver of the climbing fighters, he didn't hesitate. The first 190 flew straight into his line of fire. Warner pressed the triggers, and a storm of red-hot metal tore through the German plane's underside. The belly tanks ruptured violently, igniting in a blast that turned the fighter into a burning orange sphere. For a moment, it lit the sky beneath the bomber like a miniature sun. The second 190 screamed upward, guns blazing. But Warner adjusted again, every muscle in his back straining against the frozen hydraulics. His gloves slipped on the grips. His feet bled into his socks. Yet the turret moved another inch, just enough. His rounds shattered the canopy of the second Fu-190, pieces glittering like ice crystals as the pilot slumped lifeless over the controls. The aircraft shot past, the bomber before rolling onto its back and tumbling into nothingness. The third fighter broke away, trailing thick black smoke, a probable kill, but one he had no time to claim. The intercom erupted with frantic voices. "Tail, they're all over us. Jesus, Benny, keep firing. Get that turret moving." And then, from the pilot, his voice was tight with fear. "Do whatever you have to. We're counting on you." Warner didn't answer. Talking felt irrelevant. Everything inside him was narrowed into a single, pulsing instinct. Stay alive. His world was the icy dome, the trembling guns, the blood pooling in his boots, and the constant metallic growl of the turret refusing to obey. More fighters rose from 5 o'clock high, 2 Bf-109 seconds diving with deadly precision. Their wings winked as cannon shells streaked toward the bomber. Explosions stitched across the tail section. Holes ripped into the fuselage. Metal screamed. Warner ducked as shards of aluminum whirled past his head. He yanked the turret upward, tendons straining like wires ready to snap. The movement was clumsy, slow, but enough. As the fighters passed into his field of fire, he opened up with another blistering stream of .50 caliber fury. The first 109 took a full burst to the fuselage. It vanished in a searing flash. Pieces flung outward in all directions. The second dove straight through the flaming debris of its partner, the heat and shockwave destabilizing its frame. Warner tracked it, firing continuously. Rounds tore through the stabilizer, the rudder, then the cockpit. Smoke burst from the engine. The fighter spun downward like a broken toy thrown from a rooftop. Warner didn't know the count. Someone shouted over the intercom, "That's 7! 7!" But he had no energy to react. His turret was shaking violently now, half frozen, half battered. Sparks flew from the base. Hydraulic lines bled a thick, slushy fluid. The plexiglass cracked in a spiderweb pattern near his left cheek. He could feel the oxygen hose vibrating, its integrity compromised from earlier hits. His breaths came in harsh gasps. The air tasted metallic and thin. Yet he stayed locked in place, refusing to give an inch. Through the frost-blurred dome, he saw the last 2 fighters approaching. Their formation was confident, almost lazy, as if the German pilots believed the bomber was finished. They drifted closer, perfectly aligned for the kill. Warner felt something cold and furious ignite inside him. He braced both boots against the turret ring, ignoring the agony, and heaved with everything he had left. The turret lurched, metal grinding like a creature in pain. He forced it another inch, then another. His arms shook uncontrollably. His vision blurred, but the guns finally aligned with the approaching fighters, and that was all he needed. He squeezed the triggers. Flames poured from the barrels. The tracers lit the air like molten threads. The lead fighter exploded in a violent rush of fire. The second turned to escape, but Warner tracked it, dragging the failing turret through its final resistance. His rounds stitched across the wing root. Flames erupted. The fighter folded into a downward spiral, trailing orange fire as it fell. The sky behind the bomber went quiet. Warner gasped for air, chest heaving beneath layers of frozen fabric. 9 kills, 11 minutes. A record nobody on that bomber crew could comprehend. The intercom buzzed, then crackled with the pilot's shaken voice. "Tail gunner, speak to me. Warner, you there?" Warner tried to answer. Only a rasp emerged. He swallowed, tasted blood, and forced out a whisper. "Still here." The cockpit fell silent, stunned into disbelief. Someone let out a long, slow breath. Someone else choked back what might have been a sob of relief. The bomber flew on, battered but alive, because a 19-year-old kid refused to let death reach him. The bomber limped onward through the sky, its engines groaning under the strain of the mission and the damage it had absorbed. The left inboard engine still sputtered from the earlier flak hit. The tail section looked like it had been chewed apart by a metal-eating beast. Holes the size of fists punched through the aluminum skin, some smoking, others rimmed with frost where hot metal had met frozen air. The stabilizers were shredded at the edges, and long gashes cut through the fuselage like scars left by claws. Yet somehow, impossibly, our baby held together. And Warner, the 19-year-old boy who had turned a frozen turret into the deadliest instrument in the sky, remained slumped inside the shattered dome, his breath fogging the cracked plexiglass. The crew could barely process what had happened. The waist gunners kept glancing toward the tail, half expecting to see it missing entirely. The radio operator kept muttering, 9 kills. 9. How? As if saying it enough times would make it real. Up front, the pilot, Lieutenant Jones, flew with tight shoulders and a tight jaw, trying to maintain altitude while fighting the B-17's wounded aerodynamics. He looked toward the co-pilot, who shook his head slowly in disbelief. "Nobody's going to believe this," the co-pilot whispered. Jones didn't answer. His mind was still stuck on the moment. Warner's voice crackled through the headset, quiet, raw, barely alive, saying he was still there. Meanwhile, Warner's world was fading at the edges. His oxygen supply flickered between steady flow and thin wisps, each breath more shallow than the last. The frozen turret's shattered plexiglass let in the wind in harsh bursts, stinging his eyes and numbing his lips. His boots were soaked with blood from kicking the rigid ring. The pain traveled up his legs in pulses, but he pushed it aside, absorbing only the cold, the exhaustion, and the satisfaction, the strange, unreal satisfaction of knowing he had kept the bomber alive. He didn't count the kills consciously. He wasn't tracking numbers. He was only responding, firing, surviving, firing again. But now, in the aftermath, the enormity of what had passed began to seep into him. The bomber continued its course toward Berlin's outskirts before the formation finally wheeled south for the long journey home. Warner could barely hear what the others were saying, but the tone of their voices, half awe, half fear, told him everything he needed to know. Even within the chaos of the mission, news was spreading. Waist gunners from nearby bombers radioed excitedly. Pilots called in sightings of fireballs falling behind our baby. Some claimed they saw 3 fighters go down at once. Others described trails of smoke spiraling into clouds. One pilot reported, "Tail gunner on that lagging B-17. He's killing everything that touches him." But for Warner, none of it mattered. He just wanted the mission to end. He wanted to get out of the turret. He wanted warmth. He wanted to breathe without feeling like his lungs were filling with knives. He pressed the intercom button and whispered, "Need air. Can't breathe." His voice sounded dangerously faint. The flight engineer heard it and scrambled toward the oxygen supply lines, patching the leaks with tape and prayer. The oxygen steadied, just enough. Warner gulped it in, relief mixing with dizzy exhaustion. Hours later, after surviving the inbound run, the fighters, and the gauntlet of flak, the bomber formation finally crossed the English coastline. The familiar sight of green fields and winding rivers brought a wave of relief through every aircraft. Airfields dotted the terrain like islands of safety. The pilot of our baby lowered the landing gear, which groaned loudly but locked in place. The descent was rough. The damaged tail made the bomber wobble violently in the crosswind. Jones wrestled the controls, the co-pilot assisting with every ounce of strength. When the wheels finally touched down on the runway, the entire bomber shuddered and bounced, but held. The engines throttled down. The airplane rolled to a rough, uneven stop. Before the propellers even completed their final rotations, ground crew swarmed the aircraft. Eyes widened, jaws dropped. Mechanics, armorers, and medics stared at the ravaged tail section like they were witnessing a miracle. One sergeant shouted, "How the hell did this thing stay in the air?" Another pointed to the shredded elevators and whispered, "This should have snapped clean off." A crew chief ducked beneath the tail and stared at the turret, cracked and cratered but somehow still intact. "There's no way the gunner survived that," he muttered. And then Warner moved. Slowly, painfully, he crawled out of the turret, his limbs trembling like those of a newborn foal. When he tried to stand, his legs gave out beneath him. Two medics rushed forward, catching him before he hit the ground. One of them gasped. His boots. My God, the leather was soaked through. With blood, the insides pulped from the brutal kicks he had delivered to break the turret free. They cut the boots away and saw the damage. Swollen feet, torn skin, deep bruising. Warner winced as cold air hit the wounds but clenched his jaw to stop himself from crying out. They carried him toward the ambulance, but the bombardier shouted, "Hold up! Intel wants to see him." Warner groaned. He didn't want questions. He didn't want lights or papers or officers demanding detailed reports. He wanted a blanket, warmth, silence. But the intelligence officers insisted. They brought him into the debriefing hut, where the smell of coffee, ink, and sweat clung thick in the air. A lieutenant approached with a clipboard. "How many do you claim, Sergeant?" Warner stared blankly. "I don't know," he whispered. "I just kept firing." The intel team didn't believe 9 kills at first. Tail gunners rarely claimed more than 1 or 2 in a mission. A claim of 9 sounded impossible, exaggerated, delirious. But then the crew corroborated. The pilot confirmed the count. The waist gunners backed it up. And then came the gun camera footage. Grainy black and white films showing fireballs blooming in the sky, wings shearing off, fighters falling like burning leaves. Other bombers in the formation submitted reports, 7 separate aircraft confirming multiple kills behind our baby. P-51 escorts added sightings. The evidence stacked up higher and higher until doubt looked foolish. The final verdict came hours later. 9 confirmed kills, 2 probables. The highest single mission score by any bomber gunner in the entire European theater of operations. A record that would stand untouched through the end of the war and beyond. A record earned not through flawless machinery or perfect conditions, but through a broken turret, bleeding feet, and the sheer refusal of a 19-year-old kid to let death win. That evening, Warner lay on a cot in the base infirmary, swaddled in blankets, drifting in and out of exhausted sleep. Officers came to congratulate him. Generals sent messages. Crews from other squadrons peeked through the door just to catch a glimpse of the boy who had taken on 20 fighters alone. But Warner barely registered any of it. In his mind, he wasn't a hero. He was just a kid from Ohio who had been scared out of his mind and knew that if he didn't fight, 10 men would die. The next morning, gray light seeped through the infirmary windows as Warner slowly opened his eyes. His feet were wrapped in thick bandages. His muscles ached from the brutal tension of the 11-minute battle. His fingers still felt phantom recoil tremors from the twin. 50 cals. A nurse checked on him every hour, offering water, checking his pulse, adjusting his blankets, but the base around him was already buzzing with talk of the tail gunner who had done the impossible. Men whispered his name in the chow line. Mechanics repeated the story with wider exaggerations. Pilots shook their heads as if it were a fairy tale, not a combat report. But Warner did not rise to greet any of it. He lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment the turret froze, the moment the fighters appeared like hornets out of the sun, the moment he thought he was going to die. In the quiet, he felt both the weight of survival and the strangeness of being alive when so much should have gone wrong. Before noon, 2 intelligence officers arrived again, crisp uniforms pressed, their clipboards full. They asked for more details: altitude, angles, turret rotation, ammunition spent. Warner answered what he could. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He simply told them the truth. The turret froze solid. He forced it by kicking until the metal tore skin from his feet, and he fired at anything that got close enough to kill him. When they asked if he knew he had shot down 9 fighters, Warner only shrugged. "I was scared," he said softly. "I just didn't want to die. That's all." One of the officers paused at that, unsure how to respond. There was no bravado in the boy's voice, no pride, just a hollow honesty that made the achievement feel even more unreal. Meanwhile, outside the infirmary, the formal confirmation spread through the base like wildfire. 9 confirmed, 2 probables. A tail turret frozen at 50 degrees Celsius. A 19-year-old who refused to surrender. Commanders called it extraordinary. Veterans called it impossible. By evening, the entire 100th bomb group was buzzing. Men toasted to the tail gunner's defiance. Some swore they had witnessed pieces of the German fighters raining down through the formation. Others described seeing the turret jerking in unnatural movements, like it was being forced by brute strength rather than motors. None of them could agree on how he had managed to turn that shattered bubble into the deadliest corner of the sky, but all of them felt the same combination of awe and disbelief. Warner was released from the infirmary 2 days later, limping slightly, but able to walk. His crew greeted him with laughter, backslaps, and unspoken relief. They helped him climb back into the aircraft, not to fly, but to retrieve the jacket, goggles, and personal items he had left behind. When he entered the tail section again, he felt a wave of cold memory wash over him. The turret was still cracked, its metal scorched by gunfire, the hydraulic lines stiff with frozen residue. For a moment he placed his hand on the plexiglass dome, feeling its rough, fractured texture. It seemed impossible that this tiny space had decided the fate of 10 men. The flight engineer approached from behind and said quietly, "Never seen anything like what you did. None of us have." Warner didn't answer. He only nodded. Within a week, the official commendations began to flow. High-ranking officers visited the base to shake his hand. Newspapers requested interviews. Broadcast services wanted radio recordings. But Warner avoided all of it. He attended the required ceremony, accepted his medals with polite humility, and returned to his duties. When the press asked for a quote, he declined. When photographers tried to pose him in front of his turret, he stepped away. "I don't want to talk about it," he repeated to anyone who insisted. Some mistook it for modesty. Others thought it was trauma. But those who knew him best understood the truth. He never believed the story was about him. To Warner, the mission had simply been another day where he either fought or died. Nothing more, nothing less. When the war in Europe ended 2 months later, celebrations erupted across England. Crews danced, drank, cheered, and finally allowed themselves to imagine a future beyond the runways and blast walls. Warner packed his belongings quietly, boarded a transport ship, and returned to Ohio. There were no parades waiting for him, no reporters, just the steady rhythm of farmland, the scent of earth, and the comfort of home. He settled back into a life that felt far removed from the frozen skies above Germany. He helped his family on the farm, married his high school sweetheart, and raised children who knew him as a gentle man with calloused hands and a quiet voice. To them he was simply Dad, not the young gunner who had once held death at bay through sheer will. For decades he kept his memories locked away. He never bragged, never embellished. When neighbors asked about the war, he gave short, polite answers, changing the subject quickly. His medals stayed in a drawer. His uniform stayed in the attic. Time passed. The world changed. Historians dug deeper into mission records. Aviation enthusiasts began searching for the men behind the greatest aerial feats of the war. But Warner remained a ghost to them, present in the documents yet absent from public life. It wasn't until 2008, a year before his death, that a local historian finally tracked him down and requested an interview. Warner, then in his 80s, thin and weathered, agreed to speak for only a few minutes. The interview was simple, almost stark. The historian asked how he felt that day, what he remembered most. Warner looked down at his hands for a long moment before answering. "I was 19 years old," he said quietly. "Everything was freezing. Everything felt wrong. I thought I was going to die, but I didn't want to. That's all. I just didn't want to die." It was the only known recording of his voice describing that mission. When asked if he understood he held the record for most kills by a bomber gunner in a single mission, he shook his head gently. "Records don't matter," he said. "The crew survived. That's what matters." He passed away on the 14th of March, 2009, 2 days before the anniversary of the mission that defined his legend. He was buried in a small cemetery in Clyde, Ohio, beneath a modest headstone. No mention of fighter kills. No mention of heroism. No mention of the day a frozen turret, a broken body, and a terrified kid from Ohio stopped the largest German fighter attack of the war for 11 unforgettable minutes. But the sky remembers, the records remember, and the legacy of what he did, against cold, against fear, against overwhelming odds, remains unbroken. When every machine failed, when every system froze, when every advantage disappeared, only one thing remained: the will of a 19-year-old American who refused to die. A boy who turned a frozen turret into an unbreakable fortress, a kid who pressed back against the cold and fear with nothing but stubborn defiance. And in doing so, he became the deadliest weapon in the sky. If this story gripped your heart, if it reminded you what courage looks like when everything goes wrong, then stay tuned, because the next deep dive is even more unbelievable. A destroyer escort that sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days using hedgehogs, sonar, and pure American resolve. Subscribe, be ready, and prepare for another journey into the forgotten corners of World War II where ordinary men accomplished the impossible. Stories like this aren't just history. They're reminders of what ordinary people can become when everything goes wrong. If you want more untold moments of grit, luck, and raw human courage, you know exactly where to find them when this one ends. But before you go, let me ask you something. If you were 19 years old, freezing,